Hey guys, Space Marine 658 here, and today I'm going to bring you an episode on how to create key bindings, how to save those key bindings, and then we're also going to organize those key bindings by category. Now, as you probably already know, you have these new input actions. This is in the enhanced input system, the new one. You got these different input actions, and you've got these set up. So long as you have these all set up, what we then have is our input action context. And just so you guys are aware, if anyone is watching this, if there's a specific part of this you're interested in more than the other piece, I should have this split out by chapters. That way you can go ahead and scroll forward and find the part you're actually interested in, and actually go watch that. But anyways, once you have your input action context, you're going to put in, all these different mappings. And the way you do that is if you just right click, there's an input section here, input mapping context, and you just put in for whatever context you're using this for. So in the new input enhancement system, if you're flying a ship versus driving a car, you can have different contexts. That way your player can have a different set of key bindings per each context. And you can also set it up that way in the input key binding system. Today we're going to be talking about just with one context, but it should be pretty flexible and pretty easy to understand how you would do it with multiple contexts. And so what you have here is, as an example, I've got a pause system that has both a controller version and a keyboard version. Now, to make the key binding system work, what you're going to need to do is check mark is player mappable on every single key when you put it in here. And then as well, you're going to want to go into these player mappable options. You're going to want to give it a name, a display name, and then if you want to split it by category, a display category. I'll explain how to use this later. For now, as an example, I've put all UI items, everything that controls the UI, inside of a UI category. Now, one thing that is different between these two is that for the pause versus pause controller, I have changed the name slightly. The name is what we're actually basing our key bindings off of, but we don't show that to the player. So here I've got pause and then pause controller. This makes it so that these are treated as separate key bindings. So that way when we override, let's say we override the P button, we don't then in fact override the controller version. So once we have that all set up, you've got all your key bindings set, you've got is player mappable all set. You're going to want to create a player mappable, what do they call it? What's the full name? I believe it's player mappable input config. So that's that there at the bottom. So the PMIC. And you just add your context to here. And then just call it player controls. And so what this does is when we're accessing the key bindings, we can basically, it basically temporarily adds it to these inside of our player. And then, so once you have those all set up, what you're going to want to do is come inside your system here. So this is where I've actually got my rebinding system, and I'll show you how to make this widget here in just a moment. This is basically just a simple widget, but I'll walk you through that here in a moment. But with this, we've basically got some scroll boxes here, and that's where we're storing the different key bindings. So what I did is I created a mouse and keyboard box UI, a controller underscore UI, mouse and keyboard regular box, and then a controller regular box. Now, of course, you'll have to collapse or make visible these as you're using them, depending on which one you're clicking on. But I'm not going to cover that specifically here today. There's tons of other tutorials on how to do that. We're just focusing on the key bindings. So when it comes down to the key bindings, we're going to ignore most of this. The most important part is going to be these last two. So whenever you're setting one of these to be visible, you want to set either the clear and get keys or clear and get controller keys, depending on which one the player clicks on. Now that's if you've got it split like I do. If you don't, then you can just, clear and get keys. And what this does is it clears all of the children of all of the different boxes. and then it goes in and grabs the keys for the one that you've selected. So either get keys or get keys controller. So let's go in here and kind of show how the get keys works. So the get keys basically calls out to the player mappable config, so that PMIC, which all you have to do is basically you add this as a variable to this actual settings menu, and you just manually put this PMIC keybinds, because it's going to be the only one you should have. Then you pull out your mapping context, and from here you get all the keys inside of that mapping context. And then you do a for each loop on that, and what that does is that's going to pull out each mapping for each of those contexts. So this is where if you have multiple contexts, where you can get the different contexts. And with this, you could actually split, if you wanted to, you could split this into the different categories. So like as an example, if you had mapping context for a helicopter versus a car, things like that, you could split it off here, and that's how you'd actually do that. But we're just pulling all of our mappings, and then when you for loop through each of those mappings, these are what actually give you your input keys. So in here, we're breaking our enhanced action key mapping, and we're doing a couple things here. First, we're making sure that we're looking at a player mappable key. This is on the off chance you have a key you don't want the players to remap. So if you have something that you don't want them to touch for whatever reason, you want to make sure that this is true. And then on top of that, I'm making sure, is this a keyboard key? Is this a mouse button? Or is this an axis 3D? So that's your mouse, X, Y, Z and all that. And I'm checking, is any of those true? If any of those are true, and the is player mappable true, and it's not a pinch control, because this is for like touch screens and stuff, so like Steam Decks. I want the controller to actually handle that, since Steam Deck's more like a controller than it is a mouse and keyboard. And so I just check that it's not also a pinch. And if all of those are true, then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to actually break the player mappable key options. So remember how I had you split, add the category, so the UI here. This is where you can make that check. Now, if you have more than just the one category, you'd probably want to have some kind of switch. That way you could go between the different categories, or some kind of way to check, to go through each category. But here, since it's just the either UI or not UI, it's a very easy bool. And so at the top here, we create the widget and we add it to the UI box, and then we init text, which is part of that widget I'm going to show you here in just a moment. But if it's false, we do the exact same thing, except we add it to the MK box instead of the MK box UI. But yeah, it's as simple as that. And for the keyboard control, or for the controller keys, basically we do the inverse of that exact same thing. So we check, is it player mappable? And if it is, then we also make sure, is it not a keyboard key, mouse button, axis 3D, or is a pinch. And if those are all true, then we come in and do that same check. Is it UI? If so, we put it in the UI box. If it's not, we put it in the non-UI box. So let's go look at the keybinding widget, since that's next. Inside of here, we have basically a very simple system. We've got a button here for a reset, so this resets the key back to the default. We have an input selector. This is where the player actually selects the little button and makes the changes to whatever input they want. And then we have a text block, and this is just the key text, so the name of the text. We use the display name, that way we can have it look pretty for the player. We wrap all of those in a horizontal box, and we wrap that all in a size box. And then that is just inside of a canvas panel, which is standard stuff. Inside of here, we're going to be doing quite a few things. So we'll start with the init text. So the init text pulls in our key mapping data, our settings reference, so that is the reference to that UI element we were just in, and then our players reference. So if we go back to our settings menu here, when we're calling that key mapping data, that is the for loop that we are currently in over here. So we call that in, and then this target goes to that when we create the binding widget, because we're basically calling this on this item. And the settings ref is just a reference to itself, and then the player ref is a player pawn reference. Now, this is something that I am probably removing from this system because I don't believe we actually ended up needing it. I believe in the original version that I used, I actually needed the player reference, but I found a way to work around without it. So you may not actually need that player reference. But yeah, so we pull in the key mapping data and we set it to a key mapping variable. We break that and get the key and set that to our current key. We want to keep track of these in case we want to do anything to these specific items. We will use the key mapping later, and then the current key we can use to do some checks and things like that. Like, is this current key the same key that already is there? Things like that. From here, we take that key text and we're setting the display name here. And what this is doing, this init text is just taking the current key it already is and setting everything up so that it's in the widget when the widget is constructed. In here, we've got player mappable options name, where we're actually finding this element and seeing if it has been overridden. So if we have a different key here than the default, we're going to actually grab that from our saving game instance. Now I'll show you what we have here set up over there. But you won't be able to do this right now until we get to that actual part. All right. But yeah, and then we take the key, we make an input chord. So basically we're doing a select here. So when you set selected key on the input selector, your in selected key, we just basically use a select and then a true or false. So if this key exists, so if there is a key binding somewhere, then we want to set it to that key binding down here. But if it doesn't exist, we just use what already is the default. And then from here, we're also saving the action key in case we need that later. And then on here, we check, is this reset necessary? So if there is an input player mapped action key, so basically the player's gone in and reset the key to something different, you set it as visible. But if they have not, then it's hidden. No, yeah, we can get rid of that. That was the old way I was doing it before. But yeah, so that is basically how your key gets initialized. Now let's show off this so that way y'all can follow along, as I'm sure y'all are trying to create this as you're going along. So this is our get game instance. So when you are creating a game, you're going to have a game instance. This basically follows your game from the moment you start it up to the moment you shut it down. The way you create one of those is you just right click, and then I believe you should be able to go into Blueprint. So in Blueprint, you hit that, and let's actually just show that off. Just hit that. In here, you just type in instance, and then you're going to have a game instance. So you hit this game instance, and it's going to basically ask for a name and everything, and that's how you create this. And once you've created it, you have to go into your project settings and make sure that in your maps and modes, you actually have your game instance set here to your game instance class. If you do not do this, it will not work. Once you have all that set up, you're going to want to come in here and you're going to want to create two functions, save keybinds and load keybinds. Now you can name them whatever you want, but this is just what I called them. And then you're going to want to create these variables here. So you got the player pawn variable, you got the key bindings variable, which you want to expose. That way it's instance editable. And then you have your key binding slot, which I have just named key bindings. This is used for your save system. Here we have the event init. That is basically where the game starts. And then we're going to load keybinds. And then this here is just a volume thing, but just as an example, this is something where I'm pulling from the key bindings the volume level and then setting it here. And then this is a interface system where I'm just changing the volume. So let's go ahead and load key bindings. So what this does is it loads the game from slot and it grabs our key binding slot. And then from there, it casts to that key bindings, which I'll show you here in just a moment up here. And if it fails, so it doesn't exist, it creates the save game object key bindings and then sets it in here and says if this was successful, then it's going to pop up with these messages. If it does exist, then we, of course, we set it to key bindings, and then we go through all the indexes that exist inside of the key bindings array. So this index basically stores where those key bindings exist, what key bindings were overridden. It's not necessarily like 100% required. I do it because then I can debug it later on if I need to. And then it calls a for each loop, which goes through each of the mapping name and keys overridden from the key binding system and gets each and every one of them and adds a player mapped key in slot. So basically it comes in here into the enhanced input local player subsystem and it adds each of those keys. Now, once it's done, is completed, then it does a force rebuild inputs. There used to be some more stuff here that was required, but let me actually get rid of all of those because those aren't required anymore. With some of the changes they made, there's quite a bit that has changed. But yeah, now you just force rebuild inputs, and that will basically update the player system to have the new key bindings. So let's go ahead and now actually look at the actual key bindings save. So this is an actual save game. So it's an actual based off of the save game class. So if you actually come in here, all this stores is just these variables right here. So whatever keys are overridden as an array, the mapping name as an array, and the index as an array. And then of course I have a volume because I'm using it as a temporary settings to hold volume. Later on I'll move that out into its own settings save, but so that is where we get these. So we get our game instance. This can be called literally anywhere because it's just getting the game instance as it exists. But then we need to cast it to our specific instance. Now, since I always know it'll be a Starlight game instance, I can just do that. I'm never changing what game instance I'm running. And then from here, we can pull that key bindings out of there. And then from there, we grab our mapping name and keys overridden. And that's where we actually do our search. So we find, is there existing mapping name? Is there an existing keys overridden? And that's where we pull all that out of. Now let's move on to the next system. So our input selector, this is where, you hit the button here. And when you hit that button, it's going to call on is selecting key changed, and then on key selected. So the first thing it calls is on is selecting key changed. So that's basically, it basically ticks saying, hey, they're selecting a different key. We set is remapping true. It's just a Boolean that I created. If it is to true, so I've hit the button and then click this, what it's going to do is it's going to then set it to false, and then it's going to pull in the selected key. And it's going to grab our player mappable. So that's that PMIC keybinds. And it's getting the mapping context out of that. It grabs all of those mapping arrays, or outputs an array based on that mapping. And then from here, we just for loop through it like we did before, grabbing all of our different mappings and then for looping through all of those. And here's where it gets a little tricky. So make sure you follow along. So once we're looping through this, what we're going to do is we're going to pull off of this every loop. We're checking against a branch saying, is the selected key, so that's the new key that the player just selected, equal to this mapping's key? If it's true, then we're going to set that to none. Now, this doesn't necessarily do a whole lot because this should never happen, basically. The goal is that this would never happen. But if it does, you're going to set it to none. If it is false, so they've selected a new key, you're going to come in here, and then this branch is going to say, is the key mapping? So this is coming from where is it? Over here. So it's coming from when it was initialized. So it's saying, is this key mapping? You're going to find this current mapping. So basically we're saying, hey, let's find the current key we've clicked on, find its mapping in here. Once you have this mapping, you say, is this equal to our current index? If that's false, then you just move on because you don't want to be changing a different widget than you currently are. But if that's true, so we're changing the widget that we're currently looking at, then we're going to come in here and add player mapped key and slot. So it's as simple as we go to the enhanced input local player subsystem. We're grabbing the mapping name of the mapping here because they're going to have the same name no matter what. And then we're grabbing the selected key as the new key. Once you've done all that, then you're going to come over here and do get game instance and cast a Starlight player game instance. And then what we're doing here is we're going to either add a new key binding to that save game, or we're going to replace an existing one. So what we do is we do a find inside of this mapping name, and we basically go, does this name already exist in here? If yes, then so basically we're if it's equal to -1, that means that it couldn't find it. So if yes, this is equal to -1, that means it does not exist as a key. So we're going to add that directly into those key bindings. But if no, so it did not find that key, or sorry, all the way around. So if no, it's not equal to -1, so yes, they found the key, then we come in here with that index, and we're going to set the array element. So this index is pulled directly from this find here, so this key mapping. So from this key mapping, we're either adding an item to the array or we're editing that array. So set element array or set array element is going to take the targeted array, which is this index, and it's going to replace that index that it finds here, the mapping name, with the item, that player mappable array. And then we do the same thing for the keys overridden and for the mapping name. We basically replace them with this one, this get mapping or enhanced action mapping that we're getting from the find. So we get key mapping, we find all that, and that's replacing those items. So basically they're going to be set. These are going to be set because these won't actually be changing in terms of what actual value is stored there. But we want to make sure we still write these in the off chance that something has changed. It allows you to debug it a little easier, but this will be what is changing. So this is going to be adding the selected key instead of this already existing key over here. You don't want to be setting this key because then you're not getting your new key. You're just saving the old key into an array, and it's not what you wanted. And so once you've done all of that, you've done the init key, there's only one thing left to do. So down here, let me move this a little closer. We're going to have a reset key and an on press reset. So that button here, there's two ways to call this. This is either called in our settings menu, we've got a button here, and what this button does is it loops through every single key binding we have for the current one we have open. So we have the keyboard open, it loops through all the keyboard ones. We have the controller open, it loops through all the controller ones. But it loops through, let me actually show you where it does that. When pressed, first it sets a visible confirmation message, just because I like to have confirmation messages. But that confirmation message down here, show that. This basically says, hey, this will reset all of your key bindings for your current control scheme. If you hit yes here, this is going to take you over to here, and basically it's going to go through, is this visible? So first checks, is the controller visible? If true, then we're going to go through all the controller keybinds. If false, we're going to go through all the mouse and keyboard. What it does is it goes through each of those boxes, so the MK box and the MK box UI, or the controller box and the controller box UI. And it goes and calls that reset key on every single one of these, and then collapses the confirmation message. So basically, it's like calling this on all of them that are for that control scheme. Or you can hit this individual key and just call it on the one single key. But essentially what it does, it goes into the game instance, it removes the index of that specific key binding, if it's found, of course. So if it finds that key binding, it removes it. And then either way, whether it's found it or not, it's going to go in here and actually remove the player mapping key in that slot. So what it does is goes to this option name. Does a player mapping exist for this? If so, remove it. Now, that will only remove it for that specific slot because of how we set it up with the controller added to the end of the controller keys versus not adding it for the mouse and keyboard keys. If you had them be the same, it would remove it for both and it would add it for both when you're creating those key bindings. So you have to make sure that you do have those named differently. Once you remove that, then you have to do the force rebuild inputs, which I'm going to show you all what that is and how to do that. So that anywhere you see that, you can do that. And then basically in here, we go, is the mouse and keyboard box visible? If it is visible, then clear and get keys. So basically just refreshes the whole system. But if it is false, so it is the mouse and keyboard that is visible, or sorry, the controller that is visible, we'll clear and get controller keys instead. So that is that, and I believe for this, that is the entirety of this system for the key binding. Now let's go ahead and look at one last thing. So this force and rebuild inputs, you've probably seen that in a couple of places. So we saw that in our settings menu. There is rebuild key bindings and things like that. With the force and rebuild inputs, what that does is that is a interface, blueprint interface. So you call it there on the player. And what this does is this gets called on our actual player pawn. So we go to the player pawn. And inside of the player pawn, we've got basically this little bit of controller system, but we'll first cover this. So we got we're basically forcing to rebuild inputs, which just calls the controller, calls the local system, and then requests rebuild control of mappings. We did rebuild with flush. And that'll get everything set up correctly. So now that we've got all of this, I'm going to show you how we actually save and load these key bindings. So where that actually happens is we got this on init, it loads and saves key bindings, correct? And the save is just as simple as the key bindings to the key binding slot. Super simple. The load, this all happens. In your actual player, after you've added your mapping context, you're going to want to call a function called add override keys. This is something you need to create. It's a custom function. What this does is basically that load that we did earlier inside of the actual save system. You basically do it inside of here. Now you have to do it like this because the init in the game instance, when this is actually called, is actually before the player may exist. And so the key bindings don't always get saved to the player's actual mappable keys correctly. Now you still want to load them, but it may not actually map correctly. So what I usually do is I do this override. This just ensures that they are all saved correctly. Loaded correctly. Now to actually save the key bindings. So if we go to our settings menu, we have a button that is, let's hide this real quick, confirmation. So we have a button here called save. Super simple, super straightforward. It is right here. This calls our game instance, and then to that game instance, it calls save key bindings. So basically it just goes in and saves all our key bindings. I believe, yeah, that is pretty much everything. So let me go ahead and show you how to, you already know how to split by category. So let's go ahead and actually just show you it working. So one of the easiest ways to test to make sure that your whole system is up and working is to go to a different map and then test that it works by first starting in that map. So here we've got our main menu. We're going to go into our settings, and I'm just going to set, let's say set our thrust to 1 and 2. Hit save, so see it says successfully saved. We can also reset if we want, reset all our control schemes. But let's set 1 and 2. First, make sure, has not reset any of our other keys. So all of these look good. Thrust, thrust and reverse thrust are still set to the keyboard controls. So let's go ahead and first, let's just exit. Make sure that it actually saved. Yep, those are saved. So then let's go hit start. And this will load a different map. And let's make sure that those keys carried over here. Yep, there they are. Now let's actually make sure that we can use those keys. So if I hit 1 and 2, I should be able to go forward and backward. Now I do have another key mapped to 1, and that's why you're seeing it act all kind of funky there. But they are working, as we can see here too. And if I hit the old keys, so Shift and Control, nothing happens because they've been rebound. But if I go back here and quickly just hit reset, so here, and then boom. In fact, I think, let's see, let's test this out. If I do this, yep. And so see, even though I didn't technically hit save here, they were unbound just because I have reset the bindings. And so it basically removes the index. Now, that may be something where you want to only temporarily remove them and then require the player to save to force them to actually be removed. But for me, I think for the most part, if players are undoing key bindings, they're probably not wanting them back. So, but yeah, so I believe that is pretty much everything. If there's anything else you'd like to see, definitely let me know. But that should cover the full extent of the key rebinding system. And I'm just double checking, yeah. So, but yeah, otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Good luck and good hunting.